The room was already tense, the kind of electric silence that clings to the air before a storm. Cameras rolled, lights burned hot, and every eye was fixed on the stage. Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone, her voice steady, measured, and unshakably calm. But before she could finish her sentence, Dan Sullivan's voice cut across hers. Sharp, impatient, dismissive. "Excuse me, no. Let's be clear," he barked, slicing into her words like a blade. The interruption hit like a crack of thunder. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some shifted in their seats, others shook their heads in disbelief. Crockett paused, her expression unmoved, her posture unbroken. She had been here before, facing the very tactics designed to silence her. But this was not just another debate, this was a national stage and millions were watching. Sullivan pressed forward, piling words over hers, determined to drown her out. His tone carried the weight of entitlement, the cadence of someone too accustomed to commanding the floor. Yet in that very moment, the contrast between the two figures could not have been sharper. On one side, a man leaning on interruption as if it were strength. On the other, a woman who refused to yield her dignity. The moderators exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene. The audience murmurs grew louder, tension rising with each second Sullivan bulldozed the conversation. Crockett, however, didn't flinch. Her silence became its own kind of power, an unspoken challenge, a storm gathering beneath the surface, and then, when the interruption seemed to stretch beyond reason, Crockett's eyes lifted. Calm, focused, steeled with a quiet defiance that no outburst could shake. She waited until Sullivan's voice lost its edge, until his own frustration betrayed him. And only then did she lean forward, her words ready to reclaim the moment. The nation held its breath. Would she rise? Would she fight fire with fire? Or would she choose a different path entirely? The cameras zoomed in, catching every flicker of expression, every ounce of pressure mounting in the air. What she said next didn't just silence Sullivan, it stunned everyone. Watching? And what happens next would leave both political insiders and viewers across America reeling. This was not just another debate. It was not another evening of talking points rehearsed in green rooms, nor a sterile exchange of policy positions destined to fade into the noise of politics as usual. No, this stage had become something else entirely. A battleground, a test of character, a mirror for a nation wrestling with its own identity. Every election cycle produces moments that linger, moments that cut through the static of cable news and capture the soul of the country. Tonight's confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Dan Sullivan had all the ingredients of such a moment. On paper, it was about policy, economic priorities, national security, the future of healthcare. But beneath the bullet points lived something deeper, something raw. This was about who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and who is told again and again to sit down and be silent. For progressives across America, Crockett represented not just a candidate but a symbol. The grit of working-class roots, the resilience of women of color in public life, the unyielding insistence that dignity must have a place at the table. For conservatives, Sullivan embodied a familiar figure, a seasoned voice promising stability, but wielding interruption and condescension as weapons to maintain control. The stakes stretched far beyond the auditorium. Political strategists knew the clips from this debate would be replayed endlessly on social media, chopped into sound bites that could inspire or inflame. One sharp exchange could galvanize a base, shift undecided voters, or redefine a narrative overnight. For both parties, the pressure was immense. Every word carried weight. Every glance, every gesture, every interruption had the power to ripple outward. And so when Sullivan cut across Crockett's voice again and again, it wasn't merely rude, it became symbolic. It was about history. It was about whose voices America has elevated and whose it has dismissed. The gasps in the audience weren't just about one man's behavior. They were echoes of centuries of silencing, reverberating in real time. Crockett knew this. She understood that her every word was being measured against a broader canvas. It wasn't just her reputation on the line. It was the representation of every young woman, every immigrant family, every underdog watching from home and whispering, "Don't let him shut you down." That responsibility weighed heavy. But it also gave her a strength Sullivan couldn't calculate. Meanwhile, Sullivan seemed convinced he was winning. To him, the interruptions projected dominance, authority, command. He believed that every time he cut her off, He was reinforcing his power. He didn't see what the cameras were capturing. The audience's frowns, the viral tweets forming in real time, the quiet resilience in Crockett's eyes that spoke louder than any retort. Because this was the turning point. This was the moment when the debate stopped being about facts and figures and became something visceral, emotional, unforgettable. Sullivan's voice might have been louder, but Crockett's presence was stronger, and strength, true strength, doesn't always need to shout. What happened on that stage would not only decide who won the debate, it would ripple into the headlines, the polls, the stories families discussed at their dinner tables. America wasn't just watching two politicians spar, it was watching two visions of leadership collide, and behind Sullivan's interruptions lurked a miscalculation he couldn't see coming. To understand the drama unfolding on that stage, you have to understand the man behind the interruptions. Dan Sullivan did not stumble into politics. He carved a path with calculated steps, each move designed to project authority. Decorated resume, polished speeches, photo ops framed with flags. He built himself into the kind of figure who seemed born for podiums and Senate chambers. But behind the carefully crafted image was a pattern many had noticed, a habit that would surface again and again. Sullivan didn't debate to exchange ideas. He debated to dominate. From his earliest campaigns, Sullivan's style had been less about persuasion and more about control. He carried himself like a man who believed the microphone belonged to him by default. Opponents often described feeling steamrolled in forums, their points drowned beneath a wave of interruptions and clipped dismissals. To his supporters, this was strength, proof of conviction. To critics, it was arrogance in its purest form. His rise through political ranks had always relied on this veneer of command. But cracks in that facade had been visible long before the confrontation with Jasmine Crockett. There were moments when his dismissive tone didn't land as confidence but as condescension, leaving audiences uncomfortable, even embarrassed for him. In one town hall, a teacher asked a pointed question about education funding. Instead of answering, Sullivan waved her off with a curt, "That's not how the real world works." The crowd went quiet. A clip of the exchange circulated online, drawing mockery for days. Yet he brushed it aside, convinced he had displayed strength. This pattern repeated itself across his career. At policy roundtables, colleagues whispered about Sullivan's tendency to interrupt, often correcting others mid-sentence as if their voices were obstacles. In closed-door meetings, staffers noticed he seemed to hear only the parts of conversations that reinforced his own views. Listening in Sullivan's world was a performance, not a practice. And yet this approach had carried him far. He was a seasoned senator, after all, with years of experience to his name. He had weathered campaigns, outlasted challengers, and secured his seat through a mixture of political savvy and relentless discipline. On paper, Sullivan embodied stability. He looked the part, composed, authoritative, always ready with statistics to back up his talking points. That image was enough to convince many that his dominance in debate was a mark of leadership. But what many failed to see or chose to ignore was that Sullivan's dominance often masked insecurity. He interrupted because silence unsettled him. He cut off others not just to seize control, but to prevent uncomfortable truths from surfacing. His critics knew this. They had seen the moments when a sharp question or an unexpected fact rattled him, and suddenly the polished exterior cracked. The louder he spoke, the more it betrayed a need to shield himself. That night on stage, the same habits resurfaced. He didn't just disagree with Jasmine Crockett. He actively sought to erase her voice from the conversation. Each interruption carried echoes of his past confrontations, echoes of boardrooms, hearing rooms, and town halls, where he believed talking louder meant winning. To him, it was a familiar playbook. But what he didn't realize was how the stage had changed. Because Crockett was not just another opponent. She was sharp, deliberate, and unshakably poised. And unlike others he had faced, she wasn't intimidated by his tactics. The very interruptions he believed showed control were, in truth, revealing something else. A man rattled by the presence of someone he could not easily dismiss. As the debate carried on, Sullivan leaned harder into the persona he had cultivated over decades. The seasoned veteran, the voice of reason, the one commanding the floor. But the audience wasn't buying it in the way they once might have. In their eyes, the interruptions didn't project authority. They betrayed insecurity. Every clipped phrase and every hasty interjection seemed to confirm what many already suspected. that Sullivan's strength was more performance than principle. And this is where the contrast sharpened. On one side, a politician clinging to dominance through volume and interruptions. On the other, a challenger who understood that true strength lies not in shouting over someone but in outlasting them with calm, clarity, and conviction. The setup was almost cinematic. Arrogance standing tall, unaware that its own weight was dragging it down. Sullivan thought he controlled the room, but the real battle had only begun. Long before the bright lights of a national debate stage, before cameras followed her every word, Jasmine Crockett was a young woman who knew what it meant to fight for her place in the world. She was not born into privilege. She did not inherit a legacy of political power or financial comfort. What she inherited was grit, the kind passed down by families who worked hard, sacrificed deeply, and believed that education was a ladder worth climbing, even if every rung splintered beneath their weight. As a child, Jasmine learned early the sting of being underestimated. Teachers doubted her potential. Neighbors questioned whether a girl like her could truly make it. The world seemed designed to remind her of limits. But those limits never sat easily with her spirit. She carried herself with a defiance that wasn't loud or flashy but steady, unyielding. She read voraciously, studied tirelessly, and built her armor from knowledge and resilience. Each challenge, each dismissal was stored away as fuel, not to harden her but to sharpen her. When she pursued law, it wasn't for prestige. It was for justice. In classrooms dominated by voices that looked nothing like hers, she often found herself spoken over, dismissed, or challenged in ways her peers were not. Yet time and again she met those moments not with anger but with clarity. Professors recalled how she would pause, steady her voice, and deliver answers so precise they silenced doubters mid-breath. That ability, to remain calm while the storm raged, was not something she learned in a book. It was something she carried within her, a survival skill refined into an art. Her legal career began where most politicians would not dare tread, in the trenches. Representing those without wealth or influence, she defended the poor, the marginalized, the voices society too often pushed aside. Courtrooms became her proving ground, not because they handed her easy victories, but because they tested her patience, her persistence, her principles. Time after time, she faced prosecutors who towered over her, judges who doubted her, and clients who had already been told the system was rigged against them. And yet in those same rooms she proved that dignity could outlast arrogance, that truth could stand taller than bluster. Her rise in public service followed the same arc. She wasn't the candidate groomed by party elites. She wasn't the safe choice backed by deep-pocketed donors. She was the people's choice, the one who spoke plainly, who carried the scars of struggle in her voice, who didn't need to rehearse authenticity because she lived it every day. Campaign trails weren't paved with comfort for her. They were grueling, often underfunded, and filled with doors slammed in her face. But each rejection only made her message resonate stronger with those who had been rejected themselves. It was this authenticity that drew people to her. She didn't pretend to be perfect. She didn't posture with hollow promises. Instead, she embodied a truth that so many voters had longed to see in their leaders, that real power does not come from silencing others, but from standing unshaken when others try to silence you. Her identity, black, female, unapologetically outspoken, was both a shield and a target. Critics tried to weaponize it against her, casting her as too bold, too direct, too much. But what they saw as flaws, her supporters saw as strength. She had become a reflection of their own struggles. Immigrants striving for recognition, workers battling for dignity, young women determined to break ceilings that had loomed overhead for generations. And so, by the time Jasmine Crockett stepped onto that debate stage, she carried more than her own ambitions. She carried the weight of stories untold, of families unseen, of voters who whispered, "She speaks for me." Her calm was not weakness. It was forged in the fire of every courtroom where she had been underestimated, every campaign where she had been dismissed, every headline that had tried to shrink her voice. When Dan Sullivan cut her off, it wasn't the first time she had been interrupted. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to reduce her presence to silence, and it would not be the last. But unlike so many before, this moment was different. The cameras were rolling, the audience was watching, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been. Every pause, every measured word, every moment she held her ground carried the echo of a lifetime spent proving she belonged. She had not come this far to be shouted down. She had come this far because she knew how to turn interruptions into openings, how to transform dismissal into determination. Everything in Crockett's past had prepared her for a moment like this. The debate pressed forward, but the tension never loosened. Every time Jasmine Crockett began to outline a policy point, Dan Sullivan's voice cut across hers. It was sharp at first, like the crack of a whip, but as the minutes dragged on, it became relentless. The interruptions stacked one atop the other, each one more impatient, more dismissive, more desperate than the last. "Hold on, no, that's not correct," he snapped, leaning into the microphone as though sheer volume could overwrite her logic. The audience stirred. A few audible sighs broke through the silence. Some spectators crossed their arms. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Each interruption seemed less like strength and more like a man rattled by his inability to control the narrative. Crockett, however, remained unshaken. She didn't raise her voice, didn't roll her eyes, didn't allow herself to be dragged into Sullivan's chaos. Instead, she paused. She let him finish his burst of words, then returned to her point with surgical precision, as though his noise had never existed. That composure was her weapon, an unspoken reminder that dignity doesn't need to shout. The contrast grew sharper with every exchange. Sullivan's face flushed, his gestures more exaggerated. He jabbed his finger toward his notes, waved his hands, tried to command the room by force. But the harder he pushed, the clearer it became that his performance was slipping out of his control. By the third or fourth interruption, murmurs rippled through the audience. The cameras panned across faces that told the story. Disbelief, frustration, even embarrassment. Viewers at home could sense it too, the shift in momentum. This was no longer a debate about issues, it was a test of temperament, and Sullivan was failing it before their eyes. Crockett leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression calm, almost serene. Every subtle gesture, her steady hands resting on the table, her unwavering eye contact, spoke louder than Sullivan's interruptions. She wasn't flustered. She was waiting for the right moment to strike, not with anger, but with undeniable clarity. And the more she held that ground, the more Sullivan faltered. His interruptions began tripping over themselves, his sentences tangling, his certainty eroding. He thought he was cutting her down, but with every outburst he revealed something deeper, fear of being outshined. The moderators finally raised their voices, attempting to restore order, but it was too late. The audience had already chosen sides. Every gasp, every murmur, every shake of the head testified to what everyone could see. Sullivan wasn't in control. Crockett was. Still, she didn't gloat. She didn't rush. She let the silence stretch, let Sullivan's own frustration hang heavy in the room. Then, with measured poise, she leaned into the microphone. Her voice was calm, deliberate, a stark counterpoint to his flustered tone. And then Crockett unleashed words that left Sullivan visibly shaken. The silence that followed Sullivan's latest interruption was suffocating, the kind of silence that feels louder than any roar. Every eye turned toward Jasmine Crockett, waiting to see if she would finally snap, if she would raise her voice to meet his. But Crockett didn't snap. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned into her microphone, her tone steady, almost gentle, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment all along. "Senator," she began, her voice cutting through the tension like a clear bell, "I've let you interrupt me half a dozen times tonight. But the people watching aren't here to hear how many times you can talk over me. They're here to hear the truth." The room stilled. The audience shifted forward, drawn in, knowing instinctively that something was about to happen. Crockett didn't raise her volume. She lowered it, forcing the room to lean in, forcing Sullivan to sit in the weight of her composure. "You say you care about working families," she continued, her eyes locked on him. "But when the votes came down on raising the minimum wage, you said no. When veterans asked for better health care, you told them to wait. And when women across this country demanded the right to make decisions about their own bodies, you decided your voice should matter more than theirs." Murmurs erupted from the crowd, a wave of recognition and agreement. Sullivan shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, his hands fumbling at the papers in front of him. But Crockett wasn't finished. "And tonight," she said, her tone sharpening ever so slightly, "you've chosen the same tactic you always do when faced with uncomfortable truths. You try to silence the person speaking them." She paused, letting the words hang. "But here's the problem with that, Senator. I've spent my entire life being told to sit down, to stay quiet, to wait my turn. And every single time I've chosen to speak anyway. The audience erupted into applause, brief but powerful. Before the moderators called for order, Sullivan's face reddened. He opened his mouth to interject, but Crockett pressed forward, calm and unstoppable. "Let me be very clear," she said. "You can interrupt me, you can talk over me, you can wave your hands and raise your voice, but you cannot change the facts. You cannot erase the record, and you cannot silence millions of Americans who see through this behavior." The power in her words didn't come from volume. It came from precision, from the deliberate way she laid out point after point, each one striking like a hammer. She turned toward the audience as though speaking directly to them now. "I know what it's like to fight for every inch of ground you stand on," she said. "I know what it's like to have doors slammed in your face, to be told you don't belong, to watch others with more privilege breeze past barriers that you're still climbing. And I know I'm not alone in that. Every person watching tonight who's ever been cut off in a classroom, ignored in a meeting, or dismissed at a dinner table, you know exactly what's happening here." Applause again, this time louder, more sustained. Sullivan glanced at the moderators, clearly hoping they would intervene. But they remained still, unwilling to interrupt what had become the defining moment of the night. Crockett turned back to him, her expression firm but unflinching. "Senator, I'll debate you on policy all night long. I'll meet you fact for fact, record for record. But what I won't do is let you mistake interruption for strength. Because strength isn't shouting over someone. Strength is standing in the storm and refusing to move." The line landed like a thunderclap. The room exploded, a standing ovation breaking out in pockets of the audience before the moderators struggled once more to regain control. Social media lit up in real time, hashtags flashing across screens. "Her strength is standing," "Sure Crockett v. Sullivan," "Mic drop moment." Clips of her words were already spreading, shared and reshared by viewers who knew they were watching history crystallize in front of them. Sullivan tried to recover, fumbling through a counterpoint about experience and leadership, but his voice cracked under the weight of her calm. Every sentence he managed to string together sounded hollow, defensive, rehearsed. Next to Crockett's measured brilliance, he looked not authoritative but rattled, like a man trying to patch a sinking ship with his bare hands. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or deliver a rehearsed punchline. She simply sat back, her silence now the loudest sound in the room, and let the weight of her words do the work. For the first time that night, Sullivan seemed small. His interruptions no longer carried the edge of dominance. They carried the stench of desperation. And the audience knew it. Viewers at home knew it. Even the moderators struggling to maintain order knew it. Crockett had shifted the ground beneath his feet, not with anger, but with a kind of moral gravity that couldn't be denied. Every word hit with the force of inevitability, and Sullivan had nowhere to hide. The debate may have ended when the cameras switched off, but the moment, that unforgettable exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Dan Sullivan, was only just beginning to ripple outward. Within minutes, social media platforms erupted like fireworks on the 4th of July. Clips of Crockett's measured counterattack, especially the line, "Strength isn't shouting over someone. Strength is standing in the storm and refusing to move," shot across timelines with breathtaking speed. On Twitter, or X as some stubbornly insisted on calling it, the hashtags told the story. Strength is standing. Crockett v. Sullivan. Mic drop moment. They weren't just trending, they were dominating. Millions of impressions poured in. Influencers, activists, and even celebrities outside the political sphere weighed in. Many sharing the clip with captions like, "This is how you handle arrogance," or "The calmest mic drop I've ever seen." Memes were instantaneous. One viral edit spliced Sullivan's repeated interruptions into a loop, only to cut to Crockett's composed stare, overlaid with the caption, "You good, Senator." Another meme reimagined the moment as a boxing match, with Sullivan swinging wildly while Crockett calmly landed the knockout punch. TikTok creators stitched Crockett's lines into motivational edits, pairing them with slow-motion visuals and triumphant music. The effect was clear. Crockett's composure wasn't just political, it was cultural. Cable news caught on just as quickly. Within the hour, primetime commentators replayed the clip, dissecting every beat, every pause, every flicker of Sullivan's expression. Analysts marveled at how Crockett managed to seize control of the debate without raising her voice. One commentator compared it to watching a chess master calmly trap their opponent piece by piece, until there's nowhere left to move. Another put it more bluntly. Dan Sullivan walked into that stage thinking he'd command the room. Jasmine Crockett now owns the national conversation. But the shockwaves extended beyond punditry. Ordinary viewers felt validated, seen, energized. Comments flooded Facebook threads and Instagram reels, especially from women, minorities, and working-class Americans who recognized themselves in Crockett's words. "That was me in a meeting last week," one woman wrote. "Except I didn't have the microphone. Thank you, Jasmine, for speaking for us." Others called it a cultural turning point, the kind of moment that redefined not just a debate, but what leadership looked like under pressure. The numbers were staggering. By midnight, Crockett's clip had racked up tens of millions of views across platforms. By dawn, news outlets declared it the viral moment of the year. Hashtags turned into movements overnight, with users sharing personal stories of being dismissed or talked over. Rallying under Crockett's words like a banner, Sullivan, meanwhile, found himself on the defensive. His team rushed to frame his interruptions as passionate debate rather than disrespect, but the internet wasn't buying it. His responses were clipped, memed, and mocked, turning his attempts at recovery into further proof of how badly the moment had slipped from his grasp. For Crockett, the wave was more than just online clout, it was momentum. Her calm in the face of constant interruption wasn't just admired. It was aspirational. People weren't just replaying her words, they were quoting them in classrooms, workplace discussions, and even sermons. The message had transcended politics, transforming into a universal parable about dignity, composure, and truth. And yet, as powerful as the immediate reaction was, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The ripple effect was just beginning, and its consequences would be felt far beyond the debate stage. When the roar of applause finally gave way to a steady silence, something remarkable lingered in the air. It wasn't just that Jasmine Crockett had won a debate. It was that she had reframed what victory meant. She hadn't shouted down her opponent. She hadn't matched arrogance with arrogance. She had chosen a different weapon, dignity. And in doing so, she revealed a universal truth that stretched far beyond the walls of that debate stage. Her composure under fire reminded everyone watching that true strength doesn't come from volume or dominance. It comes from conviction. In a political climate too often poisoned by noise, Crockett offered something rare, stillness with substance. Her words didn't just land, they resonated. They became a mirror in which millions saw their own struggles. The meeting rooms where their voices were ignored, the classrooms where they were underestimated, the family tables where they were told to be quiet. Crockett turned those everyday wounds into a moment of collective redemption. The reaction inside the hall captured that perfectly. Some leaned back in their chairs, visibly stunned. Others nodded slowly, almost reverently, as if they had just witnessed something more than politics, something elemental, something human. Even a few of Sullivan's supporters couldn't disguise the grudging respect on their faces. The room had shifted. The balance of power wasn't measured in sound bites anymore. It was measured in the quiet weight of truth. And Crockett's lesson was clear. Dignity isn't passive. It is active resistance. To stand firm while being talked over is not weakness. It is courage. To speak calmly when provoked is not submission. It is command. And to answer arrogance not with fury but with clarity. That is the kind of leadership America has always claimed to admire, yet rarely rewards. On that stage, in that moment, Jasmine Crockett embodied it. It wasn't just about her either. The moral extended to every viewer who had ever felt dismissed. She reminded them that their worth was not defined by those who doubted them, that their power was not diminished by those who tried to silence them. Integrity, patience, and courage, she showed, will always outlast bluster. As the cameras began to fade and the crowd dispersed, one truth hung over the entire scene. Dan Sullivan had tried to dominate the conversation, but Jasmine Crockett had elevated it. He sought to win with force. She won with grace. And as the lights dimmed, the message was clear for everyone watching. In the end, what began as a clash of interruptions became a story of composure, triumphing over chaos. Dan Sullivan may have tried to seize control with volume, but Jasmine Crockett showed that control isn't taken by force. It's earned through conviction. Her steady presence reminded us all that integrity doesn't just survive the storm. It shines brightest because of it. This debate will be remembered not just for the interruptions, not just for the sparks of conflict, but for the moment when dignity stood its ground and won. Crockett's words carried beyond the stage, beyond the headlines, into homes and hearts across the nation, and that is the lesson worth carrying forward. Truth will always outlast arrogance, and courage spoken with calm clarity will always echo louder than shouting. But this moment isn't only hers, it's ours too. Every share, every comment, every replay of that clip extends the ripple. Every time you raise your voice for fairness, every time you refuse to be silenced, you carry the same spirit that Jasmine Crockett displayed on that stage. So here's the invitation. If you believe in dignity over arrogance, in courage over noise, then join us. Share the story. Add your voice in the comments. Subscribe and stay connected so we can continue telling the stories that remind America who we are at our best. Because this wasn't just a debate, it was a reminder. A reminder that in the face of arrogance, calm courage can still cut through. A reminder that leadership isn't measured in interruptions but in inspiration. And a reminder that when truth is spoken with clarity, the world doesn't just listen, it remembers.